My notes here say class 12, but that's wrong. I think this is class 9 that we're at so far. And we're moving along. We're almost near the end. So welcome to the class. Today, in this class, we are going to broach this concept of the new covenant by talking about atonement. And we have to understand atonement to be able to then go into more detail about what Christ really did in this covenant. Last week, for those of you who weren't here, we went ahead and did something that we did in the second half of the class on the Davidic covenant. So when we did the Davidic covenant, half of the class was talking about what it was, and then because it was talking about the throne and the kingdom, we kind of had to talk about what the kingdom was, and that in and of itself is drifting right into the new covenant. So it was a lot of talk about how Christ fulfilled the Davidic covenant. So because we did that, but we didn't do that with the Abrahamic covenant, last week's class was talking a lot about how Christ actually fulfilled the promises in the Abrahamic covenant. So that's where we kind of ended last week's class, talking a lot about how the early church, the first couple sermons, it was always covenant. Everything that they talked about when they were trying to witness, or if we want to use our words, witness or evangelize or share the good news to the people in the surrounding area, it was all talking about covenant. And that's why one of the things that we said was one of the most powerful verses in the New Testament is one that people don't really think of a lot, and that is Matthew 1:1. Because Matthew 1:1 says, "This is the testament of Jesus Christ, the son of Abraham, the son of David." And right there, on the get-go, if we use historical context, we start thinking covenant right away. This is amazing. You're about to tell me that this is going to talk about the promised one. The promised one to David, the promised one to Abraham. So big, big stuff. So once we get there, we start talking about the new covenant. So we're going to talk about some really fun stuff today that I have to thank Pastor Bob for saying, I'm going to leave this for Chris to talk about when we get there. And that is atonement theory. I can't put the date up here. Is today the 8th? 6th. See, I guess we have quite a ways to go, maybe 49 years before it's 66. Anyways, so atonement theory. We could just simply say, let's talk about what atonement is, and I could stand up here and just give my view of atonement. But that's really not what we want to do on this class. We want to recognize that we've got 2,000 years, more than 2,000 years, of scholars and churches and denominations kind of being at odds at this point when we discuss what was done on the cross. And we might say to ourselves, why is that such a big deal? He died for our sins. It's simple enough. He died for our sins. But when you start going deeper and start listening to people talk about how we have this relationship with God, you start to realize that there's some things that are creeping through. So I usually like to ask a lot of questions. So we have a few people here, so we'll ask some questions. So what do you think of when you think of the word atonement? Like, what do you think it means? Or what are some things that we sometimes say when we think about atonement? What do some people do with abbreviations? Right? They'll do things like it's at, one, meant. Right? So if we were to say atonement means at one meant. What this is implying is reconciliation. This is talking about, it is a process of bringing two separate parties back into relationship with each other. So they're separated, and atonement is bringing them to like-mindedness, bringing them back together again. So That makes sense, right? Because we're talking about Jesus is somehow this instrument where you have God on one side and you have mankind on another. And we've all seen the tracks, right? Where you've got, this big canyon, and you have a cliff over here, and you have a cliff over here, and here's mankind, and here's God over there. And then the cross lays down, creates a bridge, and that's how we get over. So that's a fun little thing too. Kind of helps drive the point home, but it's talking about this concept of reconciliation, bringing things together. However, we're going to talk about some views. And in reality, there are three main views of atonement. Okay? And we're going to do these in a chronological basis from oldest to newest, so we can kind of get an understanding of some things. Now, before I even go here, if you were here for one of the early classes, you can remember that there are way more than three views of atonement. We're just going to be talking about the three main ones. One of the books that I read was that book that's called Atonement 4 Views, where 4 different authors kind of read each other's and go back and forth and have some things. You can get books that have 100 different views of the atonement, which I think I'd go cross-eyed if I kept on reading all these different views of atonement. But anyways, we got 3 different books. The first one we're going to talk about, and the oldest one, is called Christus Victor. It's also kind of named the ransom view. Now, this keeps scratching. I guess I need to shave. Scratching something. This view, this is the oldest view. So, the Christus Victor view, this was the only view for 1100 years. So when you think about the Christus Victor view, this is basically what we're talking about. Christus Victor view is basically saying that in the garden, when God created Adam and Eve, He gave them a charge. He basically God gave authority to Adam and Eve. Okay? And we can see that clearly when we start reading scriptures and we start hearing them saying that your responsibility is to have dominion. You're supposed to multiply, take dominion over the earth. He was charged with naming all the plants, naming all the animals, and basically having dominion over this entire creation that God had made. So that was the whole plan, was that God created something wonderful. His prize possession was mankind, and He's giving the earth to mankind to have dominion over it. Gave them authority. But what happened? So we're going way back to the original story in Genesis. Well, Satan, the enemy, the devil, tricked and stole authority. You could say that Adam and Eve even surrendered the authority. Because their sin, they ended up losing that authority. Now they're stuck in a position where they no longer have dominion. But because sin and death have now entered into the world, which are tools of the enemy, Satan now has authority. So at this point, Satan has authority. But that was not God's master plan, right? It wasn't His master plan. So what is the remedy? After all of this time, the remedy is Jesus. And so what is Jesus going to do in this remedy? He's going to come And through what he does in his whole ministry, but most importantly what he does on the cross, is he's going to take back the keys and restore mankind. Now, if you think for a minute, this sounds an awful lot about what we talk about here every single Sunday. We're talking about the kingdom. We're talking about we have access to every spiritual blessing. We're talking about through the power that Jesus has in the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, we have the authority to speak to sickness. We have the authority to speak things into existence with all things with creation. So when we look at this, this paints the picture of what the kingdom is supposed to look like. So what did Jesus do? Well, basically he lived a sinless life. And then when he was crucified, he died. But then he rose again. So we have this overcoming nature, this first fruits of the new man. He rose from the grave. And when he went down into hell, right, he set the captives free, took the keys with him, and then brought them out. So we talked a lot about that when we were discussing the differences between what it means. Let me think here for a second. When you start looking back at this understanding of who Jesus is and what he did, and having the, I don't know what I'm thinking, it's not on my notes, I'll get back to that in a minute. But he takes these keys, he restores the captives, and then he gives back, Jesus gives back authority to mankind. Alright? So on a cosmic level, on a grand level, this is talking about something that Jesus is doing for humanity as a whole. That mankind was put in a place where it was locked under key. That's what I'm talking about. Last couple weeks we were talking about what it meant for us to be under lock and key of the slave master. And the slave master was the one who held the keys, and we were basically kept under lock and key. Well, in this situation, Jesus resolves that, remedies that, and takes the keys away from the taskmaster and sets the captives free and gives that authority back to mankind. So we can look at a couple of scripture verses that really do reinforce this, because we did talk about them. But as far as conferring this authority back to mankind, simply you can look at Luke, and we actually looked at this, but Luke 22:29 does say that during the Last Supper, when he's explaining to them what is going to take place, he says that I am conferring on you a kingdom, just as my Father conferred one upon me. So there's this setting things back into place and setting things right. In the garden, they were in a position of having access to this kingdom, this world, this creation that God had made. They lost it. So the plan was that Jesus was going to take back these keys, and then Jesus was going to confer that kingdom back upon mankind. So that's what you see there in Luke 22. And then even in Matthew 16:19, we see in 16:19, this is where he's talking to Peter. And he basically says to Jesus says, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by man, but by my Father in heaven." It's because Peter had just basically said, "You are the Christ." I'm in verse 18 now. "And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it." That's kind of talking about the Davidic promises. He's going to build this kingdom, build this church. And it says, 19, "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth and will be loosed in heaven." This is a reference to this. This is a reference to the authority being taken from them, but Jesus is going to give the authority back to them. He's going to give them the keys. And with Peter being one of the ones that's founding the church and one of the founding fathers, these apostles, This isn't exclusively given to Peter as if he's the only one that holds the keys. This is a universal thing that Jesus is doing. So as Peter and the rest of the apostles start this kingdom, this ecclesia, this gathering of mankind that are in Christ, we, mankind, end up having the authority to be able to move forward. So this view, this Christus Victor view, if you were to ask priests and bishops and even lay clergy and everybody, who is this Christ and what did he do? Why should I follow this Christ that you're talking about? Well, if they're Jewish, you're going to talk about fulfillment of promises. If they're not Jewish, and it expanded into Europe, and it expanded out east into South Africa, and just continued to expand, what you have is this is being shared. That mankind had authority to have dominion over the entire earth. But that's not the case anymore. And you now have the authority because you can have the power of the Holy Spirit indwell within you. And that's a big deal. You think about through all the course of time, all of the challenges that the world had because sin and death entering the world, you have this victim mentality. Especially if you weren't of the upper class and had access to riches and money and good food and whatnot. You felt a victim to the world. But what did this promise? The hope that this promised? Well, the hope that came with this was good news. This is a good news gospel right here. This is saying that God did not want that situation. That, yes, was your fault. You're the one who sinned. By you, I mean Adam and Eve, mankind. But the whole process here, it demonstrates an example of a God that's desiring restoration and is willing to do something to loosen the stronghold of the enemy, right? So that's a big deal. Now, when you hear this, depending on your upbringing, this might sound a little foreign. Because this is not really what you hear when you talk about what did Jesus do on the cross. We hear some other things. So we're going to talk about some of the other things. Post 1100. We don't have anybody snapping pictures, so I'm good. I can erase this. All right. We usually have some folks that are pictures of everything. All right, I guess I can leave the atonement theory out there. So, around 1100 AD, we have somebody coming into the scene by the name of Anselm. And he was the Bishop of Canterbury. Now, depending on your studies, you may not have any idea who that is, or you might have heard the name before, but he's a big dude. He had a lot of power and prestige and a lot of clout in the Christian community. And he came up with something that's called the satisfaction theory. So what is this thing called the satisfaction theory? Well, first of all, there's a shift in the focus. When we think of Christus Victor, the focus is restoration. The focus is bringing mankind back into proper identity, proper place, proper amount of authority, proper position. It's all about restoring things to the way that God wanted it. In the satisfaction theory, the focus shifts to honoring God. Now, that doesn't sound so bad right off the cuff, all right? We do want to honor God, right? That is what we want to do. But what this ended up saying was that the reason why the shift focused to honoring God is because what really happened was sin dishonored God. And because sin dishonored God and was so big of a deal over the course of time, that what did it do? Well, it built a wall of separation. All right? So, this wall of separation between mankind and God ends up being the focus. It's not about restoring mankind to a proper position. It's about we've got to get rid of the separation. And there's only one way that we can tear down this wall and have the separation become something that is not there, is Jesus. And this is what they believe. Jesus had to die for sin. Jesus had to die for sin because sin was so grievous it dishonored God. So if Jesus is sinless and perfect, he honors God. We were sinful. We created a wall of separation. God is dishonored. Jesus comes to set the record straight and lives this sinless life, lives this perfect life, and honors God. And therefore, by honoring God, the wall ends up coming down. Now we read things that can defend this. When you look at something like Romans 6:23, and Romans 6:23 simply says, the wages of sin are death. So throughout the course of humanity, sin has built up and built up and built up this enormous debt. And because the debt was so large, the only way that they could honor God was to have Jesus come and live the perfect sinless life. And we can look at that and we can feel remorseful because we're so sorry that Jesus, the perfect one, had to basically be crucified for our sake. So it changes the whole situation. This may sound good only if we keep the restoration part in the picture. But that doesn't happen. With the satisfaction view, it removes every aspect about restoration and simply talks about sin. Sin. You are a sinner, and it is because of what you've done you're separated. And the only way that you can get back to the Father is to trust that Jesus is the one who brought you back to God. But what are you restored to? Doesn't really say. There's no discussion of what you're restored to. It's simply saying that Jesus had to tear down this wall of separation. But what's important to note here is that with the satisfaction theory, there is no concept of wrath, which makes this theory even more attractive to some. This is not saying that God was angry at humanity and therefore poured out wrath. It just simply says that God was separated from mankind because he had been dishonored. And if he's been dishonored, he is going to deliberately remove himself from mankind. But that's not who we see in Scripture. That's not who we see God as being. God was somebody who was always chasing down. He didn't run away from sin. When Adam and Eve sinned, he went looking for them in the garden. So it's not this picture of separation because of sin. Sin was something that needed to be dealt with, and God had a master plan. But it's not something that caused God to separate himself from us. Okay? That's where we start having some challenges with this. It can look good on face value, but there's just some things that are going on that start to kind of get a little twisted, and can lead to some other things which did happen. All right? So if we now have our timeline and we keep going forward, we go forward about another 400 years, and we have John Calvin. And we talked about John Calvin, right? We talked about Calvinism. We talked about the tulip theory. We had some things. So what was this theory that John Calvin came up with? Well, John Calvin took this satisfaction theory and took it to the next step that sounds logical. And when you look at Calvinism, as we said, Calvinism, by nature, by design, is a very methodical, everything is put in place, and if you follow it line by line, you can see how it could make sense to some. All right? But he created something called penal substitution. Anybody unfamiliar with this term of penal substitution? No? Kind of have it. All right. So what does penal substitution basically say? Well, this is what it says. It says, yes, sin dishonored God. Sounds familiar, right? We just had that with satisfaction. But because sin dishonored God, the next step is sin needed to be punished. So now we're bringing in this concept of punishment into the mix. Because if God is dishonored, he needs to not just separate himself from it because it offends him, but it brings in this act of justice, that there needs to be some form of punishment that's going to take place. So what does it say? It says, well, if there's this level of punishment that is going to be poured out, Jesus stood in front of mankind as a substitute. It says that instead of all of this punishment coming upon mankind because of sin, that Jesus stood in front of humanity and he took all of the punishment upon himself, all of the wrath, all of the anger, all of the punishment upon himself instead of mankind. So what's happening here? So the focus is not on restoration. And the focus is not even anymore on the fact that God has been dishonored. But the focus here, the focus is sin's demand for justice. Now, when we look at, and how this demand for justice is going to take place through whatever, punishment of humanity. Now, oftentimes we will say, the wages of sin is death, so we're talking about the afterlife. We're talking about the reason why you need to accept Jesus Christ is not only because he is our substitute, he took the penalty for us, but it's also because while you're living, you need to be a believer. You need to be one of the elect. Because if you are not one of the elect, this punishment is not exclusively reserved for the afterlife in hell. This punishment is something that takes place every single day while you're alive on the earth and not a believer. Okay? And you see some of these things happen when you consider part of Calvin's theology, and we talked about this, the L in the tulip model is limited atonement. And if you remember, the concept of limited atonement says that Jesus did not offer atonement for everyone. He only offered atonement for the elect. Now, as bizarre as that may sound, they're all over, even right here in Del Mar, there are all types of people that believe that Jesus did not die for everyone, that he only died for the elect. Now, if you believe in penal substitution, everything starts to make sense. Because when you hear people talk about how should we respond to all of the horrible things that mankind does in the world today, whether it be groups of people that are doing catastrophic things on the other side of the world, or the person in our backyard who does something that's so horrible that you can't fathom offering any type of forgiveness to that person, let alone think that God, the almighty, all-powerful, we need to honor God, has any desire to pursue that person. It ends up saying the atonement and the blessings are only for the elect. So clearly there are some that are not the elect, so they deserve all the punishment. They deserve what's coming to them. And that's not the heart of the Father that we know of. We know that the heart of the Father is that the whole world will be saved. He does not want that anyone should perish, but everyone to come to everlasting life. So we have this challenge with penal substitution because we're going to look into some things. We could find some verses that seem to support this when we start talking about things with the ransom view. We start talking about propitiation and some of those type of things. Sounds like it would end up working out, but it takes us down this dangerous path of understanding some things. And when you think about why John Calvin came up with this theory, it's important to realize that John Calvin was, how do I want to say this? He, he was a student of the law. All right? He understood the concept of justice, of criminal justice or civil justice. And because of his law background, he turned this whole concept of atonement into this courtroom scene. So, any Carmen fans here? Ever watched the, he had all these fun little videos and he had the courtroom drama.
What was that song?
What's that?
What was that song?
I can't remember what that song was, but I bet you if it came on, we would know every single word of it, right?
Talk through it, Carmen.
Yeah, he kind of like only sung a little bit, but most of the time he was just telling a story. Yeah. And they came into the courtroom, and the guy was standing there, and he just starts going into this thing. But yeah, he paints this picture. Well, this is the prevailing theme that we see today in much of the Christian world, is this courtroom theme, this demand for justice, and if you don't get yourself right with God, you're putting yourself at risk to have God's justice, his punishment poured out for you because sin demands justice. Now, 1 John 2:2 kind of puts a little bit of confusion in the minds of the Calvinists to the point where there's a lot of Calvinists that actually reject limited atonement. And it is specifically for that verse. So if we go to 1 John, Hebrews, James, Peter, John. The short books I keep passing right over them. All right. 1 John 2:2 says, He is the atoning sacrifice for our sins, and not only for ours, but also for the sins of the whole world. So right there, it's making a statement. You can dive into the Greek if you want to, but it's not just talking about us local gathering of believers. It's talking about all of humanity, all of mankind. So Christ's atonement is not limited. The atonement is available for all. All right? So these are the three, like I said, the three main concepts. So let's talk a little bit about this punishment aspect, because we have to dive into this notion, and I think this is one of the things that you talked about, Bob, on Easter Sunday.
Make people's brains hurt.
A little bit. Forgiveness, or I guess I should say punishment. Forgiveness or punishment. So, we could just ask that question and we could just have a nice little conversation. Was sin forgiven or was sin punished? Alright? And usually, what I kind of get is people first go like this, and they kind of tilt their head for a minute and they say, well, it was kind of both. And you know what? I could be fine with that, because it sounds right. You know, we have some verses that say, you know, that mankind was forgiven, and then you also have things like, you know, Lord, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors, you know. So we have this concept of debts need to be paid, right? So was it paid for, was it forgiven? And if you read the book, because I know some of you have Welton's book, it goes into this really nice example of your mortgage payment, right? So how many people have a mortgage? I know I do. Plenty of us do. So we owe the bank, right? And we have all of this money. So when you finally pay off your mortgage and you receive that final statement that says that you don't owe anything, the bank is not going to say your loan is forgiven. The bank is going to say it's paid in full. It's basically been paid. There's no amount of that debt that's been wiped clean. It's been completely paid for. You paid for it. That's a lot different than if the bank were just to say, you know what, we're going to forgive you of your loan. And they wipe out the balance sheet and they say that your balance is zero, and it may have had a $100,000 balance on it, but they just decided they weren't going to charge you that anymore. That is a forgiven loan. Nobody paid for it. It's just absolutely forgiven. Even for myself, when we had a situation where right before Casey got really sick in 2012, I went on the high deductible health insurance plan for the family. And my deductible was $10,000. And then Casey got sick. And in 30 days, I had $10,000 of medical bills that I had to pay because of my deductible. So when I called up the hospital and said, I need some help here, we need to do some things, Amy had written down a whole bunch of things that she was specifically asking God for. I want this, I want this. And one of the things that she said is, I want half of Casey's bills just wiped clear. That was one of the things she specifically prayed. When I called up the finance department and started talking about what I could pay and what I couldn't pay for, and what the remaining balance was on it, she sliced it in half. And she wiped clean $5,000 of the debt right off the table. That debt was forgiven. I didn't pay for it, the insurance company didn't pay for it, nobody stepped in as a substitute and paid for that. It was just wiped clean. It was forgiven. So, with that concept, I just submit that the answer of both is a little bit of a delicate dance to believe in that. You're more than welcome to look into it, and we can have all kinds of discussions about how it is or how it isn't. I have said to some folks where You could use certain verbatim idioms. We talked about that, right, at the beginning of class. So if somebody paid the ultimate price for the United States, what did they do?
Laid their life down.
They laid their life down. They died. They fought in the war, and they paid the ultimate price. The firefighters at 9/11, they paid the ultimate price for freedom. We've heard that, right? They paid the ultimate price for freedom. Well, it was because they died. They gave their life up for the sake of trying to rescue and save people there. So we say the word paid, but they didn't really pay anything. They didn't settle a debt, but we use that language. We do say he paid a debt. So sometimes I personally, this is just me, not Welton or the church, but sometimes I think this concept of he paid the ultimate price or he paid our debts is because we're really saying he did offer his life. That's the biggest thing that you can do for somebody is be willing to die for them. And there's no greater gift that you can give than a man that lays his life down for a friend. That's the biggest gift that you can give. So you're giving something. So there's something to that right there. But because Calvin had this background in law, historians kind of call this transition around 1500 to, they call this the legalization of Christianity. Where Christianity has, again, had its focus shifted away from restoration and it's focused on justice. God's justice demands payment. And this is where we have that courtroom scenario. Jesus steps in and walks up to God as the judge and says, I'm willing to pay the penalty on our behalf. And in this scenario, God becomes judge, not a father. And this is where we start to have a lot of challenges with people who either have had father issues to begin with. Sometimes I even wonder if this whole thing, I am not prepared to say that John Calvin was an instrument of the enemy, because he wasn't. He had a lot of great things that he did for mankind, for the sake of Christianity. But this whole thing of drifting away from God being a father and into a judge that demands payment and demands punishment and is filled with wrath and anger is a twisted lie. It is nothing other than that. It is a twisted lie, and it keeps people from approaching him. They may be content with Jesus. Jesus is all right.
It's a good song.
It's a good song, right? Jesus is just all right with me. But God the Father? I don't even know that term. It's God is the judge. Jesus is okay. So you have this relationship with Jesus, or you have this willingness to appreciate Jesus for who he is, but you don't want to get any closer than that. Because all you've been taught is that even if you personally lived a life where your ranking your sin is pretty grievous, we know folks who said, I've done a lot of bad things, right? And we all kind of do that. We chop ourselves up, we compare ourselves against each other, and we start thinking we've done all these bad things. So we deserve the punishment, and we deserve the wrath of this God. Couple that with somebody who's never grown up with a loving father, or any father whatsoever, it just compounds the issue. It makes things really, really difficult. So what ends up happening is this gospel message went from, I should have just flipped it over, went from good news of God's chasing you down and trying to create a means for us to be back in restoration, back in relationship. It turns it into God. This gospel is a legal transaction. The earth is full of nothing but bad. And it's going to hell in a handbasket, with the exception of the elect that are in Christ. Okay? And that's what we have. So we have this wrath. He's a judge, and it's the wrath of an angry God. That we're supposed to have a relationship with, this wrathful God. It's hard to relate to him as a father. Now, on the flip side, not really a flip side, but there's some things that you have as a response to some of these things. We didn't talk about Arminianism, but Arminianism is basically a response to Calvinism. Now, Arminianism is a belief that basically takes everything that Calvinism believes and refutes it. So Arminianism isn't really a theology to live by as much as it is, I don't believe in that, I don't believe in that, I don't believe in that, and here's why, and here's why, and here's why. It's basically what you don't believe as opposed to what you do believe. But what ends up happening, if you reject this to the extreme, this is where we have this rise in this thing called the grace movement. Now, here's where we have some challenges with the grace movement. It basically, first of all, embraces penal substitution, because it says, through Jesus, all wrath was poured out on Jesus on the cross. Therefore, the cross forward, there is no wrath at all. And if there is no wrath whatsoever, it says God is never upset at our actions. Now, I know I could be venturing into steep territory because a lot of folks that believe in the finished work of the cross and this gospel of grace would say, no, that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about that grace is a license to sin. And we do understand that there are most people in a nominal grace movement don't really believe that. But there are a lot that say that God is never going to look at us and be grieved at anything that we do. And that is a dangerous place to be in, because he might not have wrath. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this wrath thing on the cross specifically, and where wrath happens to take place. But as far as, do things that we do impact our relationship? They can do. I can grieve my wife. She's going to stay my wife. I can do things that make her upset, and we have to have our own little, family time sitting at the coffee table and hash some things out and get things back into place. Well, that happens all the time in our relationship with God. He's not going to punish us. He's not going to pour wrath on us. But this concept of grace basically says he's never grieved. He's never upset. He's never going to ask us to do anything different. He's never going to ask us to change. Well, yeah, he is going to ask us to change. We're going from glory to glory. We're going into higher places as we move and become more like him and spend more time with him. We will be changed. So there are some things inside us. If the one that convicts us of sin is the Holy Spirit and he's God, and there's going to be some things that we're going to internalize that he's going to change within us. So this concept, the grace movement, where it gets it wrong predominantly is this concept of wrath. Because when you move forward in the New Testament and start looking at all the letters and even go all the way up to Revelation, you see wrath talked about all over the place after the cross. So at some point we're going to have to reconcile that situation. Because if all wrath was poured on the cross, why do the writers of the letters, why do Paul, why do Hebrews, why does John, why do they all talk about this coming wrath? You're not going to escape the coming wrath. I thought the wrath was poured out on the cross. Well, no, it's not. So this is something that we will end up, but wrath was not poured out on the cross. And that conflicts with their ideology. It's important for us to remember that if you want to try to find scripture verses in the Bible that say, because the wrath was poured out on the cross, you're not going to find them. They're not there. And I challenge you to go find them, because they're not there. They're just simply not there. So, we can look at all of this. We talked about the Christ is victor view of atonement. We talked about the satisfaction view of atonement. We talked about penal substitution view of atonement. And it would be very easy for us to say, well then, which one is it? How do we figure out what it is? Well, we could do basically what mankind has been doing for centuries now, and that is kind of, have these, 4 views, books, and debate back and forth between them. But there is a better way that I would suggest, and it has to do with allowing the Bible to be used to interpret itself. So if you ever hear me or anybody else say, first of all, let's see if we can find something in the Bible to help us with our interpretation. Let's let the Bible interpret the Bible for us. How can we begin to discuss, man, this thing must be really dirty, because my hands were not like that when I came in. We're going to begin with this. And that is, we're going to look at some types and shadows. So what are types and shadows? Well, types and shadows are things where we look into the Old Testament and we see this picture of something that's taking place. We know the end of the story. So many times, we'll even come up with our own Holy Spirit, divinely inspired types and shadows. And we could be right. Sometimes we could be wrong, but who the heck cares? It's all because the Holy Spirit's speaking to you in the Word and trying to show you something about the good qualities of God. So I say yes and amen to all that kind of stuff, right? But we can look and we can find some really strong types and shadows that talk about, well, what is this thing called atonement? What was it that was taking place? So look at the 3 main types and shadows we find in the Bible that speak specifically to atonement. And one of them is going to be Abraham and Isaac. So, you know the story, right? Abraham finally gives birth, Sarah finally gives birth to a son. The promised son, the promised seed. And he is going to be the one that all the covenant promises that God has made to Abraham are going to come to pass, right? Well, if I were to tell you that we have 3 main characters in this story where Abraham is being told to go up and sacrifice Isaac. Okay? So you know the story, right? We kind of talked about this. This is where the covenant was established when we're talking about Abraham. So you have Abraham, you have Isaac, and you have the ram at the end of the story. In those 3 characters, which one would you say best represents Jesus? Any volunteers? What's the first thing that came to mind when you think about it? You've got Abraham, Isaac, and the ram.
The ram.
Kind of think the ram, right? Because the ram was sacrificed, all right? Well, let's look at, all right, you have Isaac, Abraham, and the ram. Question, who represents Jesus? Now, put your thinking caps on, because we need to think covenant. What is covenant? And we've been talking a lot about what covenant is. And you have your ceremony, you have your signs, and then you have your promises, right? All right, so if we look at, we're going to write this down on the board here, Galatians 4, 21 to 23. If we look at Galatians 4, 21 to 23. All right, let's go there. There it is. There it is. All right. Galatians 4, 21 to 23, talking about Hagar and Sarah, right? And it says, as Paul is talking about Galatians, he says in verse 21, "Tell me, you who want to be under the law, are you not aware of what the law says? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by the slave woman and the other by the free woman. His son by the slave woman was born in the ordinary way, but his son by the free woman was born as the result of the promise." We're going to actually, we're going to go to 31, all the way to 31. So as we continue down here, it says, "Now these things may be taken figuratively." So what's happening here? Paul is about to explain who is Isaac and who is Ishmael, who is Hagar and who is Sarah. For the woman, what do they represent? The women represent two covenants. One covenant is from Mount Sinai and bears children who are to be slaves. This is Hagar. Now Hagar stands for the Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to the present city of Jerusalem because she is in slavery with her children. Thinking Christ is victor here, right? But the Jerusalem that is above is free, and she is our mother. For it is written, "Be glad, O barren woman, who bears no children. Break forth and cry aloud. For you who have no labor pains, because more are the children of the desolate woman than of her who has a husband. Now you, brothers, like Isaac, are children of the promise. At that time the son born in the ordinary way persecuted the son born by the power of the Spirit. It is the same now. But what does the Scripture say? Get rid of the slave woman and her son, for the slave woman's son will never share in the inheritance with the free woman's son. Therefore, brothers, we are not children of the slave woman, but we are children of the free woman." What it's basically saying here is that Isaac is the promised seed of Abraham. All right? If Isaac is the promised seed of Abraham, it's also, in this picture, Isaac is also a picture of the new covenant. All right? Now, we also talked about, when we were talking about this covenant being established in Hebrews 11, 17 and 19, it talks about how Abraham believed that even if he was sacrificed, that God was going to raise him from the dead. All right? So Isaac also was a picture of resurrection. Because in the eyes of Abraham, he believed that even if he died, he would come back to life. So the fact that he's still alive after this whole situation takes place is still embedded in his mind, that I still have my son. Even though he died, even though I was going up to slay him, I'm still coming back with my son. So we look at this and we end up seeing who best represents Jesus here. Well, I would submit that the one that represents Jesus is Isaac, not the ram. Because Isaac was the promised seed, and he represented the promise that was going to come through him, as well as him being a picture of the resurrection. But we also learned a couple of other things. So, Why did God tell Abraham to go up to the mountain in the first place? What did we say it was? It was a test. Right? God tested Abraham. Was God angry at Abraham? Was God about to demonstrate his wrath upon Isaac? No, he wasn't about to do that. So, if there was no wrath, if there was no anger, Isaac was not going to be punishment for some wrongdoing of Abraham. Quite the opposite, Abraham was a man of faith, right? So there's no punishment, there's no wrath. Isaac is not a substitute. We even talked about God said that even if Isaac had been sacrificed, or right before he was about to be sacrificed, God wanted to demonstrate that he's not like the wrathful, angry other gods, and wanted to demonstrate something that was different. So what was this ram? If you were to put a big question mark with the ram, well, remember, if this is the time, or one of the times, that we have something that's going to take place, the ram could easily be a picture of covenant reaffirming. We already have the ceremony took place when he walked through the separated animals and established the covenant, but this is reaffirming that there was a covenant that was taking place. God said, don't slay Isaac, I will provide the lamb. And so they made a sacrifice, they made an offering, and basically God reaffirmed his covenant with Abraham that was going to be taking place through his son, Isaac. So in this situation, if we're going to use this story as a type and shadow, we don't see wrath, we don't see punishment, we don't see substitute. All we see is a covenant being ratified or reaffirmed, or we could say established. This is what we see here with this situation. Now, we also see, like I said, I'll put this down here. The second one that we have is Passover. Passover lamb. All right? Actually, let's, Passover in general, not the lamb itself, Passover. So what do we have at Passover, right? When was the first Passover? When did it take place? Well, it took place in Egypt. So you have Pharaoh has been dealing with Moses, and God has sent these plagues down to Pharaoh, and you have all of these disasters that are taking place. And then once and for all, God makes a declaration and says that he's going to slay the firstborn of everyone. And what you need to do is do this. And he starts talking about to prepare yourself, to have this Passover meal take place, and to coat your doorposts with the blood of the lamb. All right, so it's quite easy to see. And I'll just give a reference for here if you want. 1 Corinthians 5:7. This basically does say, who was the lamb in this situation? Well, it was Christ. Christ is the lamb. So Christ is the lamb that's part of this meal that they're going to take, they're going to have. Luke 22. We read this already. When he's talking about conferring the kingdom in 19 to 20. This is where Jesus basically, we say this every time in communion. He says, this is my body and this is my blood. So he's saying, I am the lamb. I am the one that is here. He is the one. So, but let's look at some of the facts of the situation. What's taking place with Israel at this moment? What is their reality? The reality of Israel is that they are slaves. They're in bondage. They're slaves to Egypt. And what does God want to do? He wants to release them from being under bondage. He wants to take them out, set them free from being under bondage. So what does God decide to do? Well, he begins to establish a covenant. He starts to establish some promises. Now, when I was talking about the Mosaic covenant, the only time I referenced this is when I started talking about what are the signs and what are the promises. And we talked about the sign of the Noahic was the rainbow and was the promise of no more flood. We talked about Abraham, the sign was circumcision, and what was the promise that he was going to have a great name and that his seed was going to bless the whole earth. When you got to Mosaic covenant, we kind of said, well, there's no real promise. It ended up being a system of blessings and curses. But what is the sign? Well, the sign we mentioned was Passover. This was the sign of the covenant. Every time they have this Passover meal, it's because they're going to remember that there is this covenant of mercy, this covenant of rescue that is being promised to them in a way. So if they're slaves, this whole Passover meal was a covenant meal. All right? That's what we end up seeing with this. And it's very liturgical. Anybody been to a Seder and actually sat through the whole Seder? It's pretty intense type of stuff. Everything that you have to eat, and the bitter herbs and the salt water.
At almost every Passover, we would do the Seder.
Yeah, just to kind of have that picture painted, right? Now that we have this understanding of covenant, it might be really neat to do it again. But so that those that partook of the meal and shared the blood of the lamb, they're the ones that in this relationship are being protected against the enemy. All right? So we would have to ask this: if we look at some of these other atonement theories about satisfaction and about punishment, was the lamb that was sacrificed for this Passover meal done because God had wrath that he was pointing at Israel or not? Was there wrath being poured out on Israel during the Passover meal? No. There was justice that was going to take place because of the bondage and the slavery. So we have this picture of bondage and slavery, and God is creating this means, this method of restoring his people. So the blood that was poured out was not to protect them from the wrath that was being poured out against them. There was no wrath being poured on them. Nowhere in the story of the slaying of the firstborn son do we ever hear that God was angry at the Israelites, so they better protect themselves by being under the blood. We hint at it a little bit and we say the angel of death is coming, so we need to make sure that we're under the blood, but that comes from the penal substitution, that this justice, this punishment is coming and you better make sure you're under the blood. But that's not what's taking place. There's a covenant relationship that's being established, and those that are participating in the covenant relationship are spared from this 10th plague that is coming against the slave driver. Right? So that's what we have there. So there's no wrath. God was rescuing from slavery and oppression. Sounds like Christ is victor. Yet again. So I'm going to allow you to come up with your own conclusions, but again, if we're using some of these concepts, doesn't show punishment for sin, but what it does show, the first one showed covenant being ratified. This one shows covenant about to be established because of the meal. So we have one third one.
Hey, Chris?
Yeah.
One other point on the slaying of the lamb, just out of Hebrew history. The lambs that were used for atonement, there was great care taken that they not be treated roughly. And even in the slaying, it was done as merciful as you can be when you're slicing somebody's throat. But there was great care given not to mishandle the lamb.
Exactly. That is exactly right. So we'll just put that on there as we start talking about the atonement lamb. Was the atonement lamb beaten? Was it, were the priests ripping it to shreds and, doing all this gross manhandling of the lamb? No, this was a ceremony that was respected. It was a ceremony that was treated delicately, like you said, and it was all nice and clean. It was a very sharp knife, painless slice of the throat. The lamb walks with no resistance right up to the moment. Throat's cut, blood pours out. So that's what's happening here, this atonement lamb. So the atonement lamb, this is once a year. So every year at Yom Kippur, there was going to be atonement that took place. So who was the first one that did this? Well, it was Aaron, right? Aaron, and he's the high priest. So what did he do? Let's look at the pictures here, because this is typing shadows. First thing that Aaron had to do was he had to cleanse himself first. Before he could even go into the Holy of Holies with the blood, he had to cleanse himself by the blood of a bull. So he had to sacrifice a bull and cleanse himself first. And then he would take how many lambs? 2. He would take 2 lambs in, because this is what ended up happening. 1 lamb, he would slice the throat. And all of the blood that would pour out of the lamb, he would then take it into the Holy of Holies, and he would go to the Ark of the Covenant, or the mercy seat, and he would pour the blood of the lamb over the mercy seat. And that was an act of covenant reestablishment. Because what they're basically saying is, even though our covenant states that you can act in justice and destroy us, you've also put this plan into place that as long as we do this, mercy is going to be covering the Ark of the Covenant. All right? Mercy is going to be reinstated. Now, he doesn't have black dust all over his fingers, but he has a hand that's covered in blood. And he goes over to the other lamb, and he lays his hands on the lamb, and he basically speaks any remaining sins that have not been requested forgiveness for by the rest of Israel is laid upon that goat, that lamb, and that's where it's nicknamed the scapegoat, because they take that goat and they put it outside the camp and they set it free in the wilderness. And at that point, it's left to its own devices. It's probably by wolves or whatever at that point. So that's what you have taking place here with this covenant reassessment, reaffirmation. Now, Hebrews 10 states very clearly that Jesus, Hebrews 10, says Jesus is both high priest and lamb. He doesn't have to clean himself up by the blood of a bull because he's already clean. He can act on his own devices by being the high priest to go into the Holy of Holies and take his blood as the lamb. And in Revelations chapter 15, we see Jesus going into the heavenly tabernacle and going to the Ark of the Covenant in the heavenly tabernacle and placing his blood over that Ark of the Covenant. The difference that we end up seeing here is that this situation is a once for all sacrifice. Whereas Aaron, as the high priest, was yearly that it had to be done. All right? Now we could say, oh, he did that because God's justice demanded the blood of the lamb to be poured on the mercy seat. But that's not the case. The only reason why they're doing this is because the law required it. God set up a plan in the law to make a way for forgiveness to be offered. All they had to do was follow the law. And as hard as it was to follow all the rest of the law, this was one thing that they did religiously. And that is why they were so distraught when the temple was destroyed and they were banished and sent out. And when they came back, what was one of the first things that they did? Well, they worked on rebuilding the temple. Why? Because they wanted the mercy. They wanted the forgiveness of sin. And this is why, to me personally, I grieve when I see so many people getting excited about all this talk about a rebuilding of a temple again. I don't understand it personally because forgiveness has already been made available. So let's not worry about investing in a temple. Let's talk about the once and for all sacrifice that took place at it all. All right, so what do we see here is that the lamb was not a substitute for human sacrifice. There was nothing in God's justice that demanded a human be sacrificed and put on the mercy seat. Right? It was a lamb. So if Jesus is substituting anything, all right, because we talk about substitutionary atonement too, he really wasn't our substitute. He's replacing the lamb that, as the law required, was going to put his blood on the mercy seat. So it's a reaffirmation of God's covenant. So this, I'm not talking about Jesus, but I'm talking about this one. This is a reaffirming of covenant. So that mercy and forgiveness could be made available. There's nothing in this ceremony that evokes a paying a debt of sin. It was strictly covenant ceremony. Nothing more, nothing less. It was covenantal ceremony. So, when we look at what Jesus did, what is it that Jesus did? Well, his cross was the establishment of a new covenant. So now we understand that. When we say the new covenant, it's not just good news. We can now say, we've learned all about covenants. We've learned about David. We've learned about Abraham. We know about Passover. We know about the rainbow and Noah. We know about how covenants are established. So what did Jesus do? He established a covenant. And when he established that covenant, it was a once and for all sacrifice. But if it's once and for all, what does that mean? That means that this is no longer necessary. It's obsolete. It's not needed. And that's why in Hebrews 8 it says that this old covenant is obsolete and is fading away. And it's going to be no longer needed. And the reason why Hebrews mentions that is because after Jesus set up this new covenant and died on the cross and took his blood under the spiritual mercy seat, what was taking place in the temple? Sacrifices. Annual sacrifices. When they were not needed, it was obsolete. So we see all of that. Now, how much further do I want to go? Let's just identify who is the covenant with. All right? Just going to draw a line here. So, new covenant. We learned earlier, a covenant is usually between two parties, right? So if we use the Mosaic covenant as an example, we have God over here, and then we have Moses / Israel. So that's who the covenant is between. And God is the enforcer over this. He says, my word is higher than myself. And then over here, God is the enforcer. He's the partner and he's the punisher of this one. But now, in this new situation, often we hear that this new covenant is between God and mankind. But that's not the case. Because in this situation, Moses was the mediator. So it was a covenant with Moses. You had a covenant with Abraham. You had a covenant with David. You had a covenant with Noah. So you have these mediators, these ambassadors of the covenant, right? But who is the ambassador of the new covenant? It's Jesus. So who are the two parties in this new covenant? It's God and Jesus. And what better covenant to have made than to have a covenant made where is it possible for Jesus, who is man but is also God, which is called the hypostatic union, just so that you know. If he's the God-man, he cannot fail because he's God. So if he is the other part of this covenant, is there anything about this covenant that's ever going to fail us? And the answer is no. God is going to keep his end of the bargain, and Jesus is keeping his end of the bargain. All we have to do is be in Jesus, and we're able to be in this covenant. So, in closing, there's a lot of objections that you can get, because once you start drifting away from wrath, once you start drifting away from punishment, people start then trying to pull a lot of these verses. And maybe what we could do next week if we really want to, because there's a couple chapters on this, and I'll let you all decide if you want to do that. But we can start dealing with a lot of these objections. One of the objections that you commonly hear is, well, clearly God was angry at Jesus in pouring his wrath out because he turned away from him. And our proof is when Jesus quoted the Psalm. He quotes Psalm 23 and starts saying, Psalm 22, and says, my God, why have you forsaken me? See? Right there. He's already upset that God has forsaken him. I even believed when I was a youth pastor, I was saying, you see here, this is what we don't want, because Jesus had always been with God. It was just the one moment that suddenly his father's not with him anymore, and it devastated him. I gave a whole message of that as a youth pastor to somebody. Now I just want to go back in time and close that chapter out completely, because contextually speaking, when you were to quote the first line of a psalm, you were quoting the entire psalm, not just the line. So when he quotes that first line of the psalm, we need to go ahead and look at the whole psalm. So I'll let you do it on your own. We don't have to do it right now because we're running out of time, but take a look at the end, because it begins to reveal this Christus Victor theme about how God is faithful to pull us out of the snare of the enemy and put us into a right standing. So if you were to think of anything, when you think of atonement and what did Jesus do on the cross, if we want to play the Arminian role for a moment, we can say Jesus did not die in our place as a substitute. Jesus did not pay the penalty for our sin. Jesus did not receive the wrath of God. But what he did do was he established a new covenant of forgiveness once and for all. That's what took place on the cross with atonement. Personally for me, I do now pretty much lean more on Christus Victor than any other type of atonement. Like I said, there's 100 of them out there. You can pick your passion, as you want. I just encourage you to, look at types and shadows, look at scriptures, and don't just simply believe in something because it's told to you. Use the Bible and dig into it a little bit and come up with your own conclusions on that. But this, for me in my house, gospel of the Christus Victor motif is the one I believe in. All right, that's it. Nice to see you guys. Good.